Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoterica and our continuing series on the Hyper Neo Geo 64. We have a treat for you guys today. This is not an episode I had planned, but I had a lot of questions about the ports from the Hyper Neo Geo to the PlayStation 1, so I figured, hey, why not make a quick episode about it? So that's a little bit of a misnomer. There is one port from the Hyper Neo Geo 64 and one game that has the same name, even though they're different, so we will talk about that. But starting off, you're taking a look at Fatal Fury Wild Ambition on the Hyper Neo Geo 64 motherboard, and there's some definite differences in the gameplay, even though the games are the same. First off, for the PlayStation 1, you do get 2 extra characters, but as you look at the PlayStation 1 intro right here, you're going to see in the background, the 2D backgrounds have absolutely no animation. None of those background characters are moving around whatsoever, so it's very still and lifeless. Additionally, it's definitely at a lower resolution compared to the Hyper Neo Geo 64, and some of the colors have definitely been changed. But one of the biggest differences that you'll notice, and I will let you listen in a little bit, is that the audio and sound effects for the PlayStation 1 version are super muffled. They almost feel like you're listening to them through a speakerphone compared to the clear audio you're going to get off the JAMA Edge for mono or off the stereo connectors. But now as we move back over to the Hyper Neo Geo 64 version, you're going to see that there's all that animation in the background, and that really brings a lot more life to the game itself. Now transitioning to a side-by-side view, follow that little speaker icon to hear what you're hearing. You can see the huge difference in clarity in those backgrounds, and then all the different animations that are going on the Hyper Neo Geo 64 side that are just completely missing on the PlayStation 1. Now the PlayStation 1 isn't a bad port. I would say that some of the controls are a little bit touchier compared to the Hyper Neo Geo 64, and sometimes the diagonal inputs just do not register. But it's not the worst way to play the game, considering the only other way to play it is by buying an arcade board. So you definitely kind of have to pick and choose what you want to do. It's not the worst port in the world, but it's definitely not the best either. And there's some weird stuff going on with those ground textures there in Mai. But now what we're taking a look at is the PlayStation 1 version again, and you're going to see that the background is quite flat. There's no depth to it, there's no animation in the water, there's no animation over the sun where they have that kind of heat effect, and all the sound effects for the characters fighting just sound really muffled. Go ahead and listen, I'll come back in a second, we'll keep talking about it, but I want you to hear it. There's just something about the sound effects in the PlayStation 1 version. I don't know if they were sampled lower or what's going on. But if you compare it to the Hyper Neo Geo 64 version here, and I will let you listen as well, you're going to be able to tell that all the sound effects and samples are of a much higher bitrate and quality, and they're definitely not muffled. So go ahead and take a listen, and I'll be back in just a second. You can definitely tell there's a huge jump in quality on the sound effects on the Hyper Neo Geo 64 version, and I'm not sure if that's down to just bad coding on the PlayStation 1 port, or if they couldn't find the original files, but it's a really disappointing aspect of the port because the original sound effects are so good, and in the PlayStation 1 version they are so bad. But as far as the audio is concerned for the soundtrack, that sounds great because it's of a higher quality, and some of them even sound remixed. What we're taking a look at right here is one of the stages from the Hyper Neo Geo 64 version. We have that big skeleton from the ship in the background. You have those animated 2D sprites for the waves coming up over the shore. But when we switch over to the PlayStation 1 version, the stage is completely different. And that's a big issue with the PlayStation 1 port in general, is it seems to lack a lot of life compared to the Hyper Neo Geo 64. And a lot of people that think this game is not a good game are basing their opinion on that PlayStation 1 version, which really isn't a fair comparison, because while it's a decent fighting game and definitely something that's better than a lot of what Capcom did with the EX series on the PlayStation 1 in my opinion, it isn't anywhere up to the standard for the arcade board. And you will see here when we're fighting Toji, it's still outdoors, but it's completely different, and that mountain in the background has no depth to it whatsoever. It just looks like a complete static 2D image, and it's a real big disappointment compared to the Hyper version. And I think that's what's really disappointing, is that people just say this game isn't good, but they've only played the PlayStation 1 version. And while it's not a terrible port in any way, shape, or form, and it is nice that we were given the port anyway, I just don't think it's really fair to compare the two. What really doesn't make much sense to me is why they didn't just port this to the Nintendo 64, considering it shared the same CPU, so it makes no sense why they would just decide to put this on the PlayStation 1. They'd have to change the code completely. I would guess that it's probably down to the fact that Nintendo 64 cart cost so much more to produce, where a PlayStation 1 disc was much cheaper to press, but it might just be down to something like the PlayStation 1 was more popular and more fighting games sold on that platform. It's hard to say why it happened, but it is a little bit disappointing that SNK wasn't able to make this look a little bit better. I mean, the models are definitely lower polygon count, but they're not terrible. But when you just take the whole presentation in and you look at the backgrounds to see what they look like, it just kind of doesn't shine the same way the Hyper Neo Geo 64 version does. And that's just a big disappointment all around, because it is a great game and it deserved a bit of a better port than what it got. But that's the PlayStation 1 port, a semi-decent port of an awesome arcade game that unfortunately tarnishes the legacy of the game itself, because I'm assuming 9 out of every 10 people that would have played Fatal Fury Wild Ambition played it on the PlayStation 1. It's not bad, it's not great. The models definitely took a hit in polygons, and there's something really weird going on with the ground here compared to the models and the effects in the Hyper Neo Geo 64 version, which definitely look much better. But moving right along, we're taking a look at Samurai Shodown Warrior's Rage on the PlayStation 1, and people think this is a port of the Hyper Neo Geo arcade game. But SNK, just to confuse us, released 2 Samurai Shodown games with the same name. The game on the Hyper Neo Geo 64 and the game on the PlayStation 1 are completely different. They have different character rosters, they have different backgrounds, they do share some graphical effects and a couple moves, but otherwise the games are completely different. But people seem to think that this is a port of the Hyper Neo Geo 64 version, and that couldn't be any further from the truth. It isn't a bad game whatsoever, it's definitely fun, but I would say that compared to most Samurai Shodown games, this game moves so much faster. You can see the characters darting across the screen. It has a much faster pace system to it than any of the other Samurai Shodown games, and especially Warrior's Rage on the Hyper Neo Geo 64. But it does share some things, like that effect right there. You're going to see it in the Hyper Neo Geo 64 version. So I think SNK borrowed a little bit of the work from the Hyper version to bring over to the PlayStation 1, but why they would have made a game with the same name and made it different is really confusing to me. And then you have these issues where the life bar of your opponent, it's not a 2-round match. There's different stages to the match itself, and you can knock off some of their life bar. It's a different setup, and I can't say that I hate it, but it is definitely much different than your traditional fighting game, so SNK was being experimental. Now we move over to the Hyper Neo Geo 64 version. And we have another mine, or another like rocky background stage, so it's kind of like the inspiration came from one game to the other, but they actually just changed the gameplay mechanics completely and made a new game around kind of the same concept. It's almost like it's a spiritual port without sharing much or any of the assets from the original game, and it's just very confusing. But like I said, it is a fun game and you should go play it. I actually had never played it up until the point that I decided to make this video, which was about 3 hours ago, so really my time with it is minimal. But I was actually surprised to see that it wasn't a bad game, because I had read again that it was very bad. And sometimes it just goes to show that what people think about something versus what you think about it might be completely different. But it's just weird that SNK decided, hey, 2 different games, same name. Yeah, that'll make perfect sense, especially when we already have it out in the arcade and people will probably think it's a home port. And if you read some websites, to this day it still says that it is a port from the Hyper Neo Geo 64 version. But again, you get the Hyper Neo Geo 64 on the left, and you'll see that that black and white effect goes across both games, so they did borrow that, and you're listening to the sound on the left. But it's kind of weird, like I said. A lot of the intros, a lot of the stylistic choices are very similar across both platforms, even if the games are different and even if the rosters are different. Right here you have a green field with trees in the background, and over here you have a kind of like a brown field, dirt with trees in the background. So there's enough similarities to think that SNK borrowed some things from the Hyper Neo Geo 64 version, or borrowed some concepts and brought them over to the PlayStation 1 version. But that's just SNK. They've always done weird things. They've released so many Samurai Shodown games that are just called Samurai Shodown. It is really hard to keep up with them. But even in the end here, you'll see that those character animations when you win just look very similar, even if they're different. But that's kind of how the ports work for the Hyper Neo Geo 64. There is one real port, and there's one game that shares the same name, that shares some visual elements of the original Hyper Neo Geo 64 version without actually sharing any of the models or other gameplay mechanics whatsoever. But I really hope you guys enjoyed this. It was requested on the comments and forums. People really wanted to know about the port, so I figured, hey, why not make it? Short of that, we hope you enjoyed this. We'll be back on Friday with an episode, and Sunday as well, and we'll be back next Tuesday with another episode in our Hyper Neo Geo series. Do us a huge favor, go down below and hit like and subscribe, and I hope you enjoyed it. Bye-bye.